Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to our 9th session of Islamic book reviews with myself,
Already,
Usaama
wow.
al-Azami, and yes, indeed, and my colleague at the University of Edinburgh, Omar Anchassi. And this is basically, as you will hopefully know by now, an opportunity for me to speak to Omar and ask him about what he's been reading lately. He has a habit of reading a lot, and it's my way of, and hopefully your way, of getting a cheat sheet to sort of know about a lot of the literature that is just coming out and we've not had the time to turn to yet. And so we're very grateful to Omar for his time. This week's book is actually Fozia Bora's important intervention in looking at medieval history, writing history in the medieval Islamic world, the value of chronicles as archives. And it's fresh off the press. I think it came out last year, possibly.
So it came out somewhat exceptionally for our series in 2019.
Okay.
But the paperback edition came out very recently, just in 2021, which made it, put it within my range as a purchaser of books, as it were.
As I say, we usually have a particular format where Omar starts by giving a brief presentation on the book, and then I engage in a conversation with him, and in a sense pick his brain about sort of aspects of the book. And as ever, please feel free to join with your comments and with your questions. You can do that in the chat on Facebook and on YouTube, and we will get them and we'll try to respond to them in the last 15 minutes or so of the broadcast. So please take us away, inshallah, with this.
Yes, by way of preface, I should say I do have a habit of listening to the broadcast after it goes out. And I always pick up certain omissions and errors, and I have locked down a brain. So in the last session, I will contradict myself. In the last session, I referred to al-Juwayni as a Shafi'i, and I referred to him as al-Ghazali. These are, of course, distinct persons. So I beg the listeners their charity. But anyway,
I think we all understand sort of extempore discussion is going to have those sorts of things, and you very kindly add in the comments very often in YouTube. Those of us, if you want to watch the replay, YouTube is probably the most convenient spot. And Omar,
yes.
I was about to say radiyallahu ank, always is very kind and adds comments there.
Yeah. So any readings, by the way, we refer to important articles and things. I also post the references. But to proceed, this is a fascinating book, theoretically sophisticated, and the focus, you could say, although it has broad implications for the field, is on the author Ibn al-Furat, muhaddith, historian, and witness notary, who dies in 1405, so he operates in Mamluk, Egypt. And his history, Tarikh al-Duwal wal-Muluk. The interesting thing about this history is it is mostly lost, but a few volumes remain. I think the original would have been around 100 volumes, Fozia states, of which there are some extant, and the collection which is scattered all over the world. It is, as was very popular in that context, a world history that takes one all the way from creation until the author's day, of which the period from creation to the early Islamic period is extant, as well as the chronicle from the years, I think, 501 to 799 of the Hijrah. And it is a unicum copy, so there's only one of these remaining bits of it. And most of this two series, so this first series taking you to early Islamic history, and then the second part, extant, housed mostly in Vienna, which covers the later years. And in particular, Fozia is interested in exploring the value of Ibn al-Furat's chronicle as a kind of multi-layered source, if you like. So the title or the subtitle of the book, The Value of Chronicles as Archives. Yes, it is a chronicle in the conventional sense. It is analytic, so it is arranged by years. as the case of Tabari's Tarikh and so on, once you get later into the period. And although it's a unicum, and it does not seem to have been copied at all, or very little, it was widely influential, especially on later Mamluk historians. And its significance really to modern historians is for the ways in which it preserves early sources about the Fatimids. So the Fatimids, or the traditional image of the Fatimids, is they did not really patronize historical learning, or there aren't really official histories of the Fatimids produced by state-sponsored authors that span the kind of whole range, or most of the range, of that dynasty's duration. But nonetheless, Ibn al-Furat does draw on, in various kind of semi-official capacities, state servants and others, witnesses to the Fatimid reign, did write chronicles and things. Now, none of these survive as kind of independent sources. So part of Ibn al-Furat's value is that he preserves lost sources. Unlike many other Mamluk historians who discuss the Fatimids, he is very scrupulous in his citation of sources. He almost always indicates where his text is coming from, and he acknowledges the authors. And like some Mamluk authors, his approach to the Fatimids is somewhat non-confessional. So the archive, if you like, or the historiographical voice takes precedent over the sectarian one. And indeed, you do find other historians in the Mamluk period who gave the Fatimids, in some sense, a fair hearing. Al-Maqrizi, in his work Itti'ad al-Hunafa, and Ibn Khaldun to some extent as well. And later kind of Mamluk authors like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani indeed criticize authors like Ibn Khaldun and al-Maqrizi for taking seriously the genealogical claims of the Fatimids. But Ibn al-Furat is crucial because he preserves these early sources, and in the book's very extensive appendices, Fozia edits and translates all of the unique material collected by Ibn al-Furat, especially on the later Fatimids of the last century or so of Fatimid rule. The Fatimid dynasty comes to an end in 1171 of the Common Era, and he preserves around 40 reports or clusters of reports on the Fatimids, around 55% of which is unique material not found in other sources. So, as I said, a theoretically sophisticated work that makes us or poses all kinds of questions about the binary between narrative versus documentary sources. He preserves many documents, and historians kind of often make this distinction between supposedly unreliable narrative sources and documents, which are the real thing, as it were, of history that allow us to reconstruct what really happened, to use this Rankian phrase.
Right. Thank you very much, Omar. And I mean, I think one of the interesting and valuable things in this text is also that it's bringing out this figure who is largely unknown. She kind of situates him, if I recall correctly, in the introduction. She talks about the knowledge we have about someone like Ibn Khaldun, who's very, very well known, by contemporary historians. I apologize about my son's noise in the background.
Fine. This is live.
Occasionally that might sort of jump in, but I'm just sort of wondering in terms of, you described his work as a unicum, but at the same time, and suggested that it's not been copied a great deal, but at the same time you're saying that it's very influential. How on earth does that happen?
Very interesting. So Ibn al-Furat dies in 1405. He finishes his history, I think, in mid-1401, and after his death, his son sells it, and based on the Vienna copy, which and most of the second series, the second part of the extant bits are housed in Vienna. We have ownership marks and various things. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani certainly drawn it. Sakhawi, Ibn Tulun, and other major historians, especially of Egypt. So it's hopefully not entirely, well, hopefully it's apt, but he's historically speaking a kind of eminence grise. He's there behind the scenes. You do not see him. And one of the reasons you do not see him is even when he's cited verbatim, he's often not acknowledged, usually not acknowledged, in fact, as the author. And he draws on, I think the number is 12.
But you're saying, forgive me, you're saying his oeuvre was about 100 volumes, potentially?
Well, this particular historical work,
right.
Tarikh al-Duwal wal-Muluk.
I mean, I suppose this would fall under the sort of, practices of copying in the medieval era, but I would have thought that by this time, I mean, one thinks of Suyuti's plagiarism charges. I mean, by this time, those sensibilities were present and people would be complaining if they weren't cited properly, or...
Yes, well, this is an excellent question. I think the book does bring to mind. There still hasn't been a serious treatment of the notion of plagiarism in Islamic culture. Now, Joel Blecher in his book, Said the Prophet of God ﷺ, has a kind of really interesting series of comments, especially in the context of the rivalry between Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and al-Aini, and their respective commentaries on Sahih al-Bukhari. And he also discusses Suyuti, who rebutted these charges of plagiarism. But besides, every now and then you come across claims in scholarship like, well, medieval Muslims did not have a notion of plagiarism. This is false. But the contours of this idea, what exactly it meant, and so on, is still very much unclear. It deserves serious scholarly treatment, a monograph or a long paper. Now, there's been a lot of, many articles have been written on the phenomenon of seriqa, or literary theft in poetry. Specifically, Wolfhard Heinrichs and others have written important articles on this, but not much on, specifically religious literature, even though any of us, whether it's the work of Ibn al-Furat, he cites multiple sources, I think 12 main ones when he focuses on this period of Fatimid history, 4 of whom are Fatimid authors. And then you have some Ayyubid authors and other earlier Mamluk authors, including Ibn Khaliqan. Right. But often, most of the material in a text will be citation, copying verbatim from other sources. Now, what does that do for our sense of, ideas like originality, creativity? Because clearly, as many scholars have pointed out, you can express creativity and originality through, selection. Ibn al-Furat includes some sources, and amidst others through organization. The use of alphabetization, the use of, calling attention to specific features of a text through putting them in a particular place, and so on. I remember in Marlon Swartz's edition and translation of Ibn al-Jawzi's Kitab al-Qisas wal-Mudakkirin, he doesn't give a percentage, but he says, less than a quarter of that text, if you look at the word count, is actually the words of Ibn al-Jawzi himself. The rest of it is artfully arranged and selected, yeah.
So it's artfully arranged, but it's not even necessarily cited explicitly? Is that, I mean...
Well, citation practices...
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is, you're right that this deserves a study, because I feel like I'm sort of perhaps asking the wrong questions in some cases. One thinks in hadith studies, for example, I've heard of the expression sarqatul hadith, the notion of narrating a hadith which you do not actually have a legitimate isnad for. I think certain people would have considered types of wijada to be sarqatul hadith at certain points in Islamic history.
Yes, and hopefully we will have an episode on Garrett Davidson's very important book.
Right.
Now, the thing to bear in mind is, processes of certification and ijazah culture, and so all of this was important, of course. It's kind of purpose shifted, especially after the Asr of Rawaya, when all of this material was in circulation, being documented in written form. Right. But at the same time, in practice, certainly by the Mamluk period when Ibn al-Furat is writing, this had a largely, if you like, symbolic.
Yeah. I mean, it was for barakah and so on. And I mean, I liked, we're varying slightly, of course, but the notion of ijazah li ahli zaman and things like this. So, but that's in hadith studies. I think with respect to history, I mean, one would have thought tarikh is a kind of cognate discipline of hadith studies, but it looks to me, as someone who's not necessarily a specialist of chronicles of those periods, that it really became a tradition of its own, with its own sort of like norms.
Yes, but you're right to point to the connection between hadith studies and history. I'm Tarif Khalidi in his book on Islamic historiography does kind of make this connection. Think of early sources like Ibn Sa'd. This is, and he was kind of concerned with documenting hadith and mentioning which people.
But by the time we're looking at Fozia's sort of like the book, the period that her book is concerned with, it seems that you're saying that kind of citation is not what's happening. In a sense, Ibn al-Furat's sort of documentation of certain activities at a certain period of time are kind of eyewitness accounts which do not need to be cited as eyewitness accounts of Ibn al-Furat, but rather these are reports of what was happening there. And I mean, like, this is Tariq, it doesn't have the sort of stakes of law, and therefore we can sort of just engage in this kind of what is anachronistically being called plagiarism by, anachronistically calling plagiarism.
But Ibn al-Furat is unusual in the extent, as she mentioned, has been recognized for decades now by historians of the Fatimid period in particular. His carefulness in citing sources, in attributing them to their authors, and in preserving documentary sources. Now, historians, I should make this important point, often privilege in good, positivistic fashion, documentary over narrative sources. Say, a document of some kind, a tax receipt, something, or a chant. And think of these great Mamluk chancery manuals, letter writing, and so on, from state chanceries and archives. They privilege these over narrative history, and Ibn al-Furat, in some sense, disrupts the binary. Now, before the Ottoman period, in particular, the great majority of documents, she says, although we do come across caches like the Haram al-Sharif documents and others in the Mamluk period, most documents do not survive independently. As Thomas Bauer says, they're given a kind of second life because they survive in these chronicles, in these narrative sources, in other words. Mm-hmm. So there is an interesting kind of dialectic and interplay in this relationship between narrative sources and the documentary ones. And Ibn al-Furat, I should say, lives, or certainly towards the end of his life, in this extraordinary period. I remember in a previous session, Usaama, you were making this comment on how one envisions Islam, and certainly Mamluk era scholars play a huge role today in how many Muslims approach this, and they do play this oversized role now. Because the post-classical period hasn't been studied. Post-classical in the sense Ahmed al-Shamsi uses it, after the 15th century, really the Ottoman period, in places like Egypt. We can't be absolutely sure this is the case, but it seems that the Mamluk period, especially 14th and 15th centuries, was the site of an unprecedented efflorescence in a range of fields, particularly hadith and commentary on hadith and so on, but also in terms of historiography. And if I could make this point just before you intervene.
Sure.
She cites a recent historian as saying, this was remarkable, I really stopped and paused and scratched my head when I read this statement. There is more history, geography, and other kinds of writings produced in the first half of the 15th century, so 1400 to 1450, the period in which Ibn al-Furat dies, in that half century than any other half century until basically the 19th century. So a huge literary production, partly because of extensive Mamluk patronage. There's a kind of bibliomania in the Mamluk period, and an encyclopedism, also a phenomenon she discusses, and of course Ilyas Muhanna has discussed this in his book.
Who did you say after Peters? Can you just say those names again? I missed them.
So yes. So there was a kind of real bibliomania, as in this very Mamluk phenomenon of encyclopedism.
Right.
So Ilyas Muhanna has written an important book on this phenomenon, focusing on
which gets cited by Fozia.
Nuwairi, who's a 14th century figure, dies in the 1330s, I believe, of the Common Era. But these kinds of practices, so Ibn al-Furat is part of that environment. A kind of, you could say there's a fetish almost for the written word. And as part of this encyclopedic culture, remember his history is 100 volumes or so in its original version. Right. He wants to kind of document everything. And, as part of this endeavor, he preserves so many sources. Great for us because so many of them no longer exist independently.
Is this the era that also produces, collections like Subh al-A'sha?
Precisely, yes. Our friend al-Qashandi features a couple of times in this book. If you can think of another, encyclopedias of various kinds. Subh al-A'sha is really a chancery manual, how to produce official documents and so on. So he preserves many examples of these, appointment decrees for judges and this sort of very fascinating material, useful to social historians. And this kind of enriches our archive, if you like, when approaching this period. But also, things like Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari or al-Nuwairi, I mean, these are really encyclopedic works meant to kind of fill you in on what you should know, really, if you're an educated, refined gentleman.
Elias puts it in his book, The World in a Book, right?
Yes, precisely.
Yes.
And
I wanted to just briefly comment on, the remark you made, which is fascinating, that the amount of history produced in the first half of the 15th century kind of dwarfs anything that came after it. And
or indeed before.
Fascinating. And you sort of referenced also the, you said that I had commented how, our vision of Islam is, I'm of course drawing on Ahmed al-Shamsi's conception, not conception, but the way in which he has brought to light the extent to which our perception of what Islam is shaped by these sort of choices by certain invisible actors. And in a sense, I think just by the sheer literary production of the Mamluk era, and the Mamluk era is of course far vaster than that. You go back to people like Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Dhahabi, and these great encyclopedists, al-Dhahabi being a classic case of that. And later on Ibn Hajar and so on. And you think, we think of the Mamluk, our conception of Islam is shaped by all of these people writing in the Mamluk era so often, right? And the power of the word sort of has a hold over us, I think, to this day.
Yes, partly so many works extant from that period because it's relatively recent compared to us, unlike 8th and 9th century Baghdad. But there is also the kind of dimension, Suyuti, who's often said to be the most prolific author
apparently he said about his own older contemporary al-Biqai that he was more prolific than I was, but I guess there's a question of chronology. When did he say that?
Yeah. Right. But it's a consideration that if you want to defeat your opponents, outright them, Suyuti certainly did. But to return to the book, so not only is this kind of stuff in the air, this culture of encyclopedism and tendency towards comprehensiveness, something Ahmed al-Shamsi also talks about, the preservation of texts in other texts, kind of where the biographical dictionaries or what have you. And he gives the example of, we can think of an example. So in Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya, of Ibn of the Subki, he preserves works that are otherwise lost to us. Whole treatises, dozens of pages in length, and Ibn al-Furat is kind of a part of this culture, but par excellence, if you like.
Right. No, I was just going to say. I think the example that Ahmed gives, if I recall correctly, is Usul al-Tafsir of Ibn Taymiyyah being preserved entirely in apparently the Sharh of the Ihya of Zabidi, which seems to, if I recall correctly, it would be a bit.
I'm aware there's a scholar, gosh, I can't remember if it's Aryan Post or someone else, who's actually writing on the textual history of the Usul al-Tafsir of Ibn
Tafsir.
Taymiyyah, if
Okay.
you like. I mean, it's also cited. I mean, I don't believe it's cited in its entirety, but it's cited without attribution in Ibn Kathir's introduction to his tafsir.
Right.
So, multiple means of preserval. And of course, we can also study, why was it printed in the 20th century and what were the choices that kind of led to this. It's come out in many editions. And as well as encyclopedism, you have what Fozia calls the kind of archival mentality. Not only the instinct to preserve, but this, citation of documentary sources. So he, in some sense, he straddles this binary between narrative and archival sources.
So she actually sort of spends a little time on the theory of the archive, so to speak, and thinking about exactly what an archive is in a way that, as someone who's not familiar with that tradition of scholarship, it kind of gave me a different perception or perspective on what exactly an archive is meant to be. And I wonder if you would like to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so she draws especially on post-structuralist theory, and she uses terms like archivality, and there's an explanation of these in the early part of the book. But the archive should not be thought of primarily as a space. We're thinking, especially when it comes to Ibn al-Furat, we're thinking of archivality in the archive as a kind of practice. So think also of Brinkley Messick's book, which we may wish to do an episode on. He kind of the more recent one, but anyway, he kind of also appeals to this terminology of the archive. I have to say the kind of post-structural theory is a bit of a blind spot for me, to put it mildly.
And yes,
but it does enrich the analysis, in my view. It does help her to drive her argument forward.
Right.
And in particular,
I wanted to particularly sort of highlight so her subtitle is the value of chronicles as archives, and so I'm assuming that archive here is being used in somewhat this post-structuralist sense that you've put forward, but in a sense, what can we get out of chronicles in this way? By picking on Ibn al-Furat, I think it's a little counterintuitive for me because we've lost so much of it. I don't know how much of it is extant in the Unicum, but
in these two kind of sections, but most of it is lost.
Right. In what way could a chronicle in this way be used as an archive for modern researchers, for example?
Yes, so Ibn al-Furat specifically, I suppose because he preserves all of these lost sources, a large volume of which is unique. So we have voices, or we hear voices in his chronicle that we do not find elsewhere, including authors in the Fatimid period who are witnesses to the events they describe. So it's a kind of cacophony of voices, again, which he permits to speak. But yes, so
you highlighted that he was noteworthy, and Ibn Khaldun as well, for not being overly ideological in their portrayal of the Fatimid sources. And you said Ibn Hajar actually objected to this, and I wonder if you could sort of explain a little like that dynamic. So, what makes because I've also commented in the past about the challenges of objectivity in some sense, but what is it? Well, I mean, I think
I should say part of the kind of one of the broader points the book makes, drawing on the post-structural theories, in trying to kind of undermine or at least complicate this idea that the documentary source is objective, narrative source is bad, if you like.
Right.
But she notes, for instance, that Ibn al-Furat, although he does refer to them as Banu Ubayd, so the ones who accept the Fatimids' genealogical claims I mentioned were Ibn Khaldun and al-Maqrizi, specifically in Iti'ad al-Hunafa. So I do not believe Ibn al-Furat accepts them. So he refers to them as Banu Ubayd, which is the kind of derogatory, you're not actually Fatimids guys way of addressing them. Why does Ibn Khaldun do this? And remember, their peers. Ibn Khaldun dies in 1406. Ibn al-Furat dies in
That's
1405.
1405.
Maqrizi is the student of Ibn Khaldun. So this is the kind of relationship. Ibn Khaldun says in the Muqaddimah, so it's a kind of methodological point, well, they wouldn't really have been able to gather all of these followers and be so successful in Egypt, where their, genealogical claim baloney, to put it as Americans would. So he expresses a kind of methodological skepticism, and he kind of makes bigger points off the back of this. Now, there's been a lot of debate in the historiography about, and then the modern literature, al-Maqrizi specifically, because it's sometimes claimed incorrectly, Fozia states that he was in fact a descendant of the Fatimids and, as it were, was defending his forebears. But certainly an author like Ibn al-Furat, he refers to them as caliphs and as imams, not to say that he recognizes the legitimacy of these claims, but he refrains from using charged terminology like malahida or heretics.
Right. Yes. He points that out.
And a couple of Mamluk era authors in particular, because we're primarily dependent on Mamluk authors when doing Fatimid history. There are some Ayyubids as well, of course.
Right.
You find these kind of diverse trends. Some are condemnatory in tone, but others regard the Fatimids as having, in some sense, put Egypt on the map, and they do celebrate some of the achievements of the Fatimids. These are all Sunni authors, we're talking about.
Fascinating. Right. Fascinating. I mean, I wasn't aware of what might be perceived as somewhat adulatory sort of takes on the Fatimids, especially since they were seen as such a threat by the Abbasids, of course. But I guess this is centuries later in retrospect, and saying, well, they didn't really sort of ultimately do that, and they're not very important anymore. So now we can talk about them with a certain degree of distance and not feel threatened by them. Yeah.
There is a kind of black legend of the Fatimids, if you like, and I know there's an excellent thesis on this, whose name I will post in the comments for the video, on Fatimid traditions of learning under the Fatimids, and especially what happened to the Malikis and their chains of authority and teaching practices and so on under the Fatimids.
Right.
There's a kind of black legend that the Fatimids. Sorry.
Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani comes to mind, as this figure who sort of lived in the Fatimid Egypt. Yeah.
Well, he's Qayrawani.
Well, I mean, no, he's. Yeah. Sorry, I'm mixing up states, aren't I?
That's fine, but now, there is this legend that they put, and there would have been, I imagine, some persecution of Sunni ulama, but for the most part, the population was left as it was. There's some debate about whether or not, in different periods of Fatimid history, Sunni judges were appointed. But for instance, some of our important early sources on the Fatimids, those who actually wrote, in the Fatimid period, often they were servants of the state. And people like al-Qudai, she mentions the Shafi'i, who was a servant of the Fatimid state and wrote this important historical work, which partly commemorates them. And sometimes the Fatimid era authors, their confessional identity is not straightforward or clear. So there were, the authors on the Fatimid period that Ibn al-Furat draws on, mainly, Egyptian and Syrian, particularly Egyptian, but some Syrian as well. It's not always clear. Some of them were 12 Shia, others may or may not have been Sunni. And I mean, there's even a debate about the religious identity, which I find kind of odd as a non-specialist, of Al-Qadi Nu'man himself, the kind of chief judge of the Fatimids, and the guy who, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say, built single-handedly the edifice of Fatimid law. Da'im al-Islam and many, many other works which are of huge importance to Ismaili communities, the Bohras, certainly to this day. And that's interesting.
I want to sort of, and this is perhaps a digression I should have suggested much earlier on in this session, but in a sense, can you give us an idea of the period, the rise of the Fatimids, in very sort of skeletal form,
Yes.
They come. I'll sort of take my own sort of attempt as someone who's not a specialist in that period, but I mean, I think of the Fatimids as coming about, you know, in a sense, in their earlier periods when they were suddenly a strong state and they were doing their da'wah, etc. They were a threat to the Abbasid Caliphate. You know, we're thinking Mawardi, Juwayni, al-Ghazali, their kind of responses to this. But later on, they kind of, in a sense, are really affected by the Crusades, which start up around, you know, during Ghazali's later life, so to speak. And thereafter, the rise of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi as a sort of a scion of, forgive me, my history is kind of, but Nuruddin al-Zengi is coming from a, you know, different kind of clan and family and so on. But in a sense, these people come, and Salahuddin al-Ayyubi basically comes and vanquishes the Fatimids, and of course takes the Azhar and converts all of these sorts of things. The Azhar was established by the Fatimids. So we're talking about a period which is not immensely long that they were in power, and there were plenty of Sunnis living in Egypt at that time, and it wasn't really my understanding.
The majority of the Muslim population. And you have a debate about when exactly Egypt became majority Muslim. Some would not date that until the Mamluk period, as in the work of Tamil Lakis had some discussion of this. But yes, the Fatimids kind of emerged with kind of state power, if you like, in...
And forgive me, just one more point, which is that they were relatively sort of easygoing with having all of these sort of non-Fatimids. They didn't necessarily, my impression is they didn't necessarily impose that, you know, setting aside their geopolitical aims and their desire to sort of be a counter-caliphate to Sunnism, so to speak. Within their state, they seem to have been largely benign towards the Sunnis. Is that a fair sort of assessment?
Well, I mean, you know, they appointed Ismaili judges and, of course, patronized Ismaili learning, set up institutions of higher education and so on.
Right.
I mean, I'm really not the expert.
Right, fair enough.
I also don't want to depart too far from. So they emerged in the Maghreb, and already, so Al-Qadi Nu'man himself writes what is a very important source, and the Institute for Ismaili Studies, in collaboration with Oxford University Press, has edited and translated many of these interesting sources that cast a light on the Fatimids. So Qadi Nu'man writes Iftitah al-Da'wah, which is a kind of important early account of the rise of the Fatimids, as it were, and they then transfer to Egypt, which they rule for approximately two centuries or so before they're brought to an end by Salahuddin in 1171. But, you know, politics makes strange bedfellows, and the kind of, you know, one thing we ought to emphasize is, you know, the sectarian boundaries, of course, take time to crystallize, but even once they have, theologically speaking, as indeed is the case today, relations, sectarian, you could say, intersectarian relations are a complex phenomenon. And they're amenable to the same kinds of analysis as any other social and political phenomena. Something Usaama Maqdisi really emphasizes in his book on the ecumenical frame, or age of coexistence, anyway. A book we should perhaps do an episode on. So we don't want to centralize about these sectarian relations as well.
Forgive me, Usaama Maqdisi's book just came out, I think, right? A year ago or so?
A year ago or so.
Right.
So, but important, I mean, again, I don't want to depart too much from...
Sure. I mean, these are all, I think, very useful and important sort of ways of thinking about, you know, the themes that are addressed in this book. And I think, you know, in a sense, we're grateful for Fozia for allowing us to engage the work in this way that allows us to branch out to so many other dimensions of the ideas that are found within it.
Yes, so as I said, it is a book that does have broader implications for the field, for doing history, for ideas of, you know, this binary, for instance, between documentary narrative sources, you know, how Ibn al-Furat reflects the kind of this late Mamluk context, and how he exemplifies, you know, certain trends within the writerly culture, if you like, of later Mamluk Egypt, and this kind of thing. And it's
So I'm just going to alert you to the fact that we have another sort of 15, 20 minutes, and we do have some questions, so we'll get to those in a moment. But if you wanted to sort of maybe have some closing thoughts on the book specifically.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot more that could be said, but it's quite a focused study. And she does kind of suggest these broad implications, but really it's a study of Ibn Furat and his history and how it exemplifies archival mentality, you could say.
I'm just wondering, so how is this related to? So Fozia has written in the past about the sort of libraries of the Fatimids, and I think you mentioned that this doesn't figure in any prominent way in this text, but
yes,
I mean, are there shared themes across that work?
Absolutely. So we should mention Fozia won the Royal Asiatic Society Staunton Prize for her outstanding article on Salah ad-Din and the libraries of the Fatimids. What was the traditional narrative with Salah ad-Din and the libraries of the Fatimids? You know, he destroyed them in one form or another. They were cast into the sea or something like this, and then disposed of in various ways. Now, if you actually scrutinize the sources, and again, she tracks this cacophony through various Mamluk era chronicles and Ayyubid sources as well, and reveals that actually this isn't what happened. The books were, claimed and sold off, and Salah ad-Din's Qadi al-Fadil, I think, had a major role, and his library was, augmented considerably by these books. So, as with books, which are physical artifacts, physical objects, and they do have a kind of history of their own, they actually survived. And she makes this point about Ibn al-Furat, and chronicles generally. These sources outlived, by a radical span of time, the institutions that produced them. Ibn al-Furat was a preacher and teacher in the Mu'azziyah madrasa. Who's even heard of that these days, you could say, besides a few historians, and yet his work has endured. Now, again, the parallels are interesting. These texts continue to survive, even though the library itself was dissipated as a kind of collective. And yet the book survived. So Ibn al-Furat has this similar kind of relationship with all of these sources and documentary tidbits that he's preserved in his chronicle, and they're given a kind of second life through his writing them into his chronicle, as it were.
And I think we have a few questions, and people can feel free to sort of ask questions, more on the themes that we've discussed today, drawing on Fozia's book. We have questions from a very consistent question of ours, who's a good friend of ours, Jan Islam. So he writes first, commenting on our remarks about plagiarism earlier, that there is a fiqh opinion which states that knowledge cannot be stolen, and in fact the thoughts we produce do not even belong to us, but like our bodies belong to God, in a sense are an amana, I suppose. And I'm not familiar with the sort of the latter part, but it's fairly sort of normal in the earliest periods of Islam that when there was discussion of ilm, the fuqaha did not consider it to be inappropriate that someone copy a book, right? I mean, this is how transmission of knowledge occurred in those times. I guess the question is, how important is attribution, right? I mean, everyone's copying manuscripts out. Nowadays, people are printing en masse, and there'll be that little C which says copyright, and the attribution is absolutely essential.
Yes.
But yes, I mean, if it's a fiqh opinion of Abu Hanifa or Malik, and you just say, okay, this is a fatwa from a reliable scholar, or it's given by a reliable scholar who's drawing on Malik or Shafi'i or Ahmed, there doesn't need to be that kind of...
It really depends on the context. So, certainly attribution would have been important in contexts like hadith reporting.
Right.
And, authentication and the need for, proper transmission and, actually having met the the Rawi and heard hadith from him, and so on. And partly, as we've seen, because on a very basic level, you need to know how to pronounce words correctly. And even in later periods, beyond the 4th century, there are cases of scholars being criticized for having, reported books and discussed or what have you without having actually attended audited sessions. Now, and this is something that comes up quite extensively in Ahmed al-Shamsi's first book, Canonization of Islamic Law, where he notes, for example, that you do have your diehard Ijaza folk today, but already in the Mamluk period, he says, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani said, of the whole Shafi'an corpus, attributed to Shafi'i, only I think he says the Kitab Jima' al-Ilm and the Risala have had continuous isnads, leading
so
up
Jima'
to...
al-Ilm is very short. The Risala obviously is quite substantial, but Jima' al-Ilm is a tiny book.
Yeah, so most and in practice, with the introduction of paper and this kind of shift from primarily oral to, you could say, primarily written, although oral and also continues to play. This transformation, Ahmed al-Shamsi really elaborates in great detail in his first book. The introduction of paper plays, of course, a big part in this shift. And writing technologies and so on, and radically expands the horizons of literary production, if you like. So the Mamluk flourishing or efflorescence of history and other and hadith and all of these other genres is of course a function of partly the introduction of paper. And you have paper coming in from European sources as well. I know there's been some interesting work on the Fatwa of Ibn Marzuq on European paper. By Leo Halavi and other scholars.
How that was much later than the European paper phenomenon, as far as I recall.
No, I mean it's in the 15th century and so on.
Right. So I'm
so
thinking,
later Mamluk era authors are or particularly places like Venice and so on. Paper is coming from these places across the Mediterranean to Egypt.
Right.
So you have an elaborate legal discussion of what do you do if there are kind of crucifixes.
You said Leo Halavi talks about this in his.
Well, specifically the Fatwa of Ibn Marzuq, but there is quite a literature on this. But I don't want to kind of get against straight from the point too much. So, and also you find hadith, condemning kitman al-ilm, which certainly has been understood even in the modern period to allow one to disregard rules of copyright. Even I was told stories by students or friends and students at the University of Medina and so on that some ulama took this opinion so seriously that if they're asked in an examination what is the ruling on XYZ or what do you say about XYZ, they would not be able to restrain themselves because this would constitute kitman al-ilm. So that's just an interesting kind of side note. And I can see Jan is also asking about a kind of loose understanding.
So I'll just read it out if that's all right. So is it possible that this loose understanding may explain, meaning a loose understanding towards plagiarism, may explain less stringent rules of citation? Alternatively, we know that people were generous in quote-unquote borrowing, so to speak.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's such a big question that really hasn't been tackled. Of course, the kind of copyright issues received extensive discussion by the Majma' al-Fiqh in Jeddah and so on.
In the modern period, sure.
In the modern period.
I mean, in a sense, this is such a radical transformation on the pre-modern sort of like tradition. And also modern technologies allowing for certain, I mean, over the last 200 years, allowing for this mass production of knowledge.
So again, Ahmed al-Shamsi has discussed this transformation, and having a mass availability of printed text means, in theory, we have thousands and thousands of copies of more or less identical texts, and without that context, citing page numbers and all other kinds of bibliographic practices we now take for granted would not have made sense. And always an important part of literary practice.
I'm just going to highlight that point, if that's all right, Omar. I mean, like, that's it's an obvious, but it's something which I have a tendency to forget, that if you have a manuscript culture where people are writing out texts, you're not going to have the same page, right? So it makes no sense to cite in that sense. The most you can say is such and such a person said in his book. But I guess there would
And of
also
course,
be the question
different
of,
copies of books. I mean,
yeah,
not that printed editions are without their errors,
yeah,
and lists of errata and so on printed to the back. But in scribal cultures, editions of a text might vary, or different manuscripts might vary widely. I mean, there's just been an article came out in December in the Journal of the American Oriental Society that I thank Ahmed Samsi for alerting me and others to, on the Kitab Arad al-Zanadiqa wal-Jahmiya attributed to Ahmed bin Hanbal, where the author does a very diligent job based on the existing manuscripts of tracing the textual history of this work.
right.
And he says it's kind of, there are three texts that emerge in different contexts, and they're kind of floating around, and they're stuck together in some of the manuscripts in different recensions. So, these are kind of the challenges one has to bear in mind for, a scholar like Ibn al-Furat, who may have had access to different versions of texts. And one of the things that Fozia does so well is to kind of point out where Ibn al-Furat has been cited by later authors, bearing in mind that most of the time this is without attribution. And it's only through this kind of very careful philological work that one can get a sense of the celebrity and that he enjoyed, if you like, among later Mamluk historians of the Fatimids. Especially, I mean, Ibn al-Furat, mostly we're talking about the last century of Fatimids rule.
I should point out, Jan Islam's question is quite long, and so it seems to have been split in two by StreamYard. So, the first part we looked at, and it ends with this we know that people were generous in borrowing, so to speak, quotes, and statements of others. So the second part of the question is, and statements from others. One thinks of Thomas Jefferson copying John Locke, and I'm not as familiar with sort of Jefferson and his engagement, but that would have been in a time when print existed. So that's interesting. I mean, again, it takes a while for a serious culture of copyright to emerge.
But Suyuti was accused of plagiarism. He was accused of passing off works, found in the Mahmudiyya library, which is the largest public library in this period in the Mamluk domains. Finding works there, writing his name.
What was at stake? I mean, what's at stake today is something very specific, which is the monetary consequences of copying a text for the author and in particular the publisher, because the publisher is usually the agent in the legal process. But what was at stake in that context? Because no one's making money per se out of this. It's just pure reputation.
Not as such, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, this really deserves further study. It's not absolutely clear. I mean, partly it's about prestige. So, in the rivalry between Ibn Hajar and Al-Aini, clearly, these are both commentaries on Bukhari that are, highly intertextual and cite many sources and so on. But at the same time, there is clearly originality, right, as well. However we understand this concept, it was important to the authors. Ibn Hajar understood he was doing something unusual and important, if you like.
I mean, I think our conceptions of originality are sort of very distinctive in the, you can say, post-Renaissance era, post-Enlightenment era. And the term originality has this kind of mystique around it, I think, in cultures. But you do have, notions of originality in poetry, and even in sort of like ijtihad, and there's one thinks of Ibn al-Arabi, al-Qadi Abu Bakr, going to the sort of Mashriq and gaining this knowledge and coming back to the Maghrib and saying that, I've brought ulum that no one has, and so that, there is that sort of recognition that a type of originality is desirable. But I think there's a kind of an importance to originality in a modern European.
But the contours of the concepts themselves, plagiarism, originality, creativity, these really do vary by context.
It's very nice to see Sher Ali Tareen, a good friend of both myself and I assume Omar, you know Sher Ali personally.
Yes, and we discussed an episode in hopefully the near future, inshallah, on his excellent book.
Absolutely. I
depending on
mean,
modernity.
we both love your book, and we look forward to discussing it. But thank you very much, Sheikh Ali Tareen, for those who are on the podcast, is kindly saying, excellent podcast, great idea and discussion. Many thanks to you, both of you, and thank
Yes.
you, Sheikh Ali, for
And
tuning
the
in.
new books in Islamic studies podcast I enjoy tremendously, which
Absolutely, of course,
as a
a
hand in
regular
hand.
contributor.
And many other podcasts. I mean, where
Yeah,
you could say there's an embarrassment of riches, particularly in the COVID era. I myself listen to many, whether it's the long-standing and well-known Ottoman history
right.
podcast, or indeed new books in Islamic studies, or the Abbasid history podcast, which is also very fun. So I do commend all of
Yes.
these to our
And
listeners.
we take inspiration from them for our own work at the end of the
Of
day.
course. Yes.
We have come, very much to the towards the end of our discussion. I wonder if we should perhaps briefly discuss next week's sort of offering, inshallah. So, Omar,
Sure.
if you could kindly, inshallah.
Great. So next week we will be looking at a very recent book, Salim Ibrahim's Women and Gender in the Quran, published by Oxford University Press, with many prestigious taqareed, if you like, from the likes of Marion Katz and
Right.
Karen Bauer. So definitely a book that one should pay attention to. I can
partisan
see
bug.
an important question, by the way, from Iftikhar,
Yeah.
Dr. Iftikhar Malik of Bath Spa University.
Okay, sure. I've got it on the screen. Please, I'll have a quick read of it for the podcast listeners. In the case of Indian history, and for that matter, other such traditions, the European classification under ancient, medieval, and modern is problematic, as they conflate with Hindu, Muslim, British phases. This is actually a point that's highlighted by Fozia in the introduction.
Yes.
And thus induct a hostile communalism into scholarship. Do we see similar problems, a similar problem with medieval here and other studies that on that period in reference to other regions of the Islamicate? And we neglected to highlight this, but this is precisely a point that
So yeah, I mean,
Fozia makes.
Fozia does discuss excellently
Yeah,
this problem of terminology.
yeah,
So she generally prefers to refer to the middle period,
right.
I think, in kind of Hudsonian sense, and does discuss the problems with the idea of the medieval in this Mamluk context. But we're kind of at the end of the episode. I wish I had kind of focused more. So she is kind of very interested in questions of genre, of terminology, and periodization,
Right.
which, as Dr. Malik points out, do have tremendous implications for one's approach to the period. I mean, I always avoid the use of the word medieval, because when we think medieval, we think the quest for the Holy Grail of Monty Python, and all kinds of problematic resonances.
Right.
Associated with it. But thank you for this valuable point, and of course, in the Indian context, even more problematic. You could say.
But I mean, if I can use this as an opportunity to highlight a problem that it's not necessarily a problem in the context that I referred to, but I was saying that, as Fozia points out, this early 14th century, and I'm using Common Era dates as well. That's also an indication of influence from Europe. But early 14th century documentation of history on such a massive scale has an impact on the way in which we read history, the way we perceive a field, so to speak. And European traditions of writing about the ancient, the medieval, the modern, these are the things that we need to master in order to be recognized as scholars, and then they inevitably have these impacts on us. And I think I'm sure a scholar like Dr. Malik is probably speaking with a post-colonial hat on to a certain extent, that this is in a sense, the raison d'etre of efforts like post-colonialism and decolonial thought, that how do we escape that Eurocentrism, in a sense, that embeds these traditions of thought.
Yes, because where does this category of the medieval, this periodization, ancient, medieval, modern emerge from?
Right. Where does it come
from?
from?
The creation of the Renaissance. Scholars like Petrarch, diligent, classicists, if you like. So it's really a self-designation that is the medieval, and we are the modern. A very kind of self-congratulatory designation, for sure.
I'm very sorry that, I mean, there are other very interesting questions coming. Aisha Said asks, what are possible
Yes.
alternative references? But,
I mean,
we've
Khalid
come
Blankenship,
to
by the way, has an interesting essay on periodization of Islamic history. I can post
Okay.
the reference in the comments on YouTube.
In the comments on YouTube afterwards, so that would be wonderful. But thank you, Aisha Said, and Hebara Izzat, I assume beaming in from Turkey. Thank you very much for joining. Very kindly saying I enjoyed listening. Not my field, but was enriched.
Yes, and it is an enriched and enriching book, which I commend to our audience.
Absolutely. We kind of, I kind of interrupted your introduction of Celine Ibrahim's book, so I think we should do it a little more justice, if that's all right. Just to, if you can hold it up again and
yes.
briefly sort of explain. Yeah.
Women and Gender in the Quran.
Yeah.
A very comprehensive study, judging from the bibliography.
Right.
And I just discovered, teaching my Islamic law class, she has an excellent Encyclopedia of Islam 3 entry on menstruation. So that is
fantastic.
Certainly one I look forward to discussing with you all next week. And it is a kind of comprehensive account of women and gender in the Quran.
And a kind of selfish plug, or a sort of self-promotion in a sense. Like she is a graduate from the department I graduated from as well. Although she did her undergraduate there, I believe, and I did my postgraduate studies there. So she's a Princetonian like myself. So I look forward to having another fellow Princetonian in a week's time. And thank you all for joining. Thank you, of course. Really, my primary thanks goes to you, Omar, for diligently going through these texts.
And then from
of course. I mean, the sort of the raison d'etre of this entire episode is the writings of the great scholars whose books we are engaging, and so I've in a sense engaged Fozia on some of these ideas going back more than a decade from when she was doing her PhD in the department where I was an undergraduate at the time. And so, it's just an honor to be able to read her book and to engage it with so many wonderful scholars joining. Thank you again. And with that, we'll see you in a week's time, inshallah. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.